Today's daf is daf Chaf Dalid. On daf Chaf Dalid, we had the boy Minei Rav Yochanan Mishmuel with a machlokas about whether there is Avelus B'Shabbos or there's no Avelus B'Shabbos. And there are two ways of explaining that machlokas. One way is that if you hold Yesh Avelus B'Shabbos, it only refers to Dvarim B'Tzina. Ein Avelus B'Shabbos means there's no Avelus even B'Tzina. Another way of explaining it is that Yesh Avelus B'Shabbos means the full-blown Avelus, and Ein Avelus B'Shabbos means that it's only knowing B'Dvarim B'Tzina. And now we're up to Amar Shmuel, Pachaz Chova. So you'll see this approximately 12 lines down from the top. So Pachaz is Rashi Tevis, is a Nutrikon, and we'll go through all three, and that's a Chova. Chova means that on Shabbos of Avelus, this is what the Avel is required to do. And Nitar Nun Taf Reish Rishus, that's optional. So now we go through Pachaz, and what we're going to try to understand is that these are requirements, because otherwise people will think that he's praving Avelus, that he is being knowing Avelus. So Priyas HaRosh means that he's not allowed to be Otef Es Rosho, right? The Avel had to wrap around his head a covering over his head, and that was a Siman Muvhak that he was an Avel. So that has to be avoided on Shabbos, and therefore he should do Priyas HaRosh. He should uncover his head, take off that covering that he wore the rest of the days of Avelus, so as not to undermine the Shabbos. And then the Ches of Pachaz is Chazoras Kera Lachorov. He's wearing a beged karua during his Avelus. On Shabbos, he should turn it the other way around. It should be towards the back, so nobody sees it. Zekifas Amita. During the days of Avelus, he turns his bed upside down. That's Kfiyas Amita. But on Shabbos, he is Zokefas Amita. And all those three, Shmuel says, are a chova, because if you're not going to fulfill these three, then it will be an obvious manifestation of Avelus, which is antithetical to the Shabbos. One thing that's interesting here on this list of Pechaz is Kifas Amita, because that's something that is B'Tzina. You know, he walks around with the garment, if it's ripped, he walks around with an Atifas HaRosh, but Zekifas Amita or Kfiyas Amita is only done in private. So in the notes here, he mentions that in the case of overturning the bed, why is it considered b'farhesia, that it would undermine Shabbos, that maybe the beds were commonly back in the day kept in the open, it was visible to those who might come in and out of the house. Now we get to the Rishus. Now we have Nitar. The Nun stands for Nilas HaSandal, and apparently even someone who's not in Avelus might take off his shoes and wear slippers or rubbers or sneakers, I don't know what, and therefore it's not an absolute requirement that he wear shoes on Shabbos, because even if he's not wearing shoes, it's not obvious that he is an Avel. And then we have Rechitzas Yadayim Raglayim B'chamin Arvis. We're talking about washing our hands, our feet in hot water on Erev Shabbos. And this was something that was done in honor of the Shabbos. But the truth is that even if he would not do this rechitza, no one would necessarily identify it as Avelus. It's a kind of Chevi Altas situation. So wait a minute, we missed the Tuf. Let me go back to the Tuf. Tashmish Hamita. Again, that's something that's private. No one has to know whether or not he was Mishamish Mitaso, and therefore there's no requirement after that he has to be Mishamish Mitaso. Rav Hamar, Af Priyas HaRosh Rishus. Rav is of the opinion that there are people who cover their head and wrap some garment around their head, some cloth around their head, similar to Atifas Arash, even though they're not available. And therefore, he doesn't have to abstain from Atifas Arash. He can wrap his head around with a cloth, and it's not a direct, obvious, antithetical to Shabbos expression of it. Shmuel, Maishna Nilas Asandal Dirishus. Why does Shmuel lay back low, and he allows you to either wear shoes or not wear shoes during the Shabbos of Avelus? And the Lav Kuliyama Avidi Desaimi Masanayu. Not everybody wears shoes. As we said before, there are other options. Is Priyas Arash Nami Lav Kuliyama Avidi Demiglu Rashayu? Not everyone will uncover his hair. There are people who, even though they're not Avelim, will wrap a cloth around their head. So Shmuel seems to be a little bit inconsistent over here. And Rav is the one who points out that Priyas Arash is a Rishus. Why didn't Shmuel accept that? To the same extent he accepted that Nil Sasandal is a Rishus. And the Gemara says, the answer is that Shmuel Tamei, the Amar Shmuel, Kol Kera She'eno. So we're going to read two parts of Shmuel's statement. The first part will be picked up in the Gemara. It's not relevant to us right this minute. Kol Kera She'eno B'Shas Chimum. If he doesn't do the Kriya immediately after the burial or after the Shmua that he heard that his relative died, it has to be at a moment of intense grief, and that's when he has to do the Kriya. And if he doesn't do it b'shas chimum, that's not called Kriya. He's just ripping his garment, but it's not a kiyum of avelus. Now, here's the point that we want to get to now. Shmuel says that kol atifa she'ena katifas ishmaelim ena atifa. The way that you have to fulfill as an avel the mitzvah atifas arash is a very specific method called atifas yishmaelim. And if he doesn't do the atifas arash in the way that the Yishmaelim do it, then that's not avelus of atifas arash. Memela, it comes out that since Shmuel has a very specific, singled out method of atifas arash, that's why he has to avoid atifas arash on Shabbos. It's not that other people might do this even though they're not avelus. That's not so, because we're talking about a very unique and specific kind of wrapping of the head, which is called atifas yishmaelim. Machvile Rav Nachman ad guve didikna. So Rav Nachman wanted to demonstrate this with his hands, and he took a wrapping and he wrapped himself around it till it reached the hollows of his cheeks. That's a very unique style of wrapping the head. That's called atifas yishmaelim. And it's only used by avelim, so that, if you don't remove that kind of atifas arash, which is atifas yishmaelim on Shabbos, then everybody knows that's a very conspicuous form of avelus. Amar Rav Yaakov, Amar Rav Yochanan, lo shanu ela she'elo min olim beraglo. Aval yesh lo min olim beraglo min olav mochichin olav. What happens is the following, that Rabbi Yaakov, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, is going to suggest that the issue of atifas arash will depend upon whether he's doing something that obviously demonstrates that he's not an ovel. For example, and this is what Rabbi Yochanan speaks about, when he's wearing min olim baraglov. Once he's wearing min olim baraglov, it's clear that he's not praving avelus. And this is because on Shabbos there's no avelus. So he's already waved a flag that he's not observing the laws of avelus. He's wearing shoes, which he's not allowed to wear during the rest of the week. And in that case, then we don't care one way or the other whether he uncovers his head or leaves his head wrapped in a kind of atifas arosh, because he's already demonstrated that he's not an ovel. It's obvious he's not an ovel because he's wearing shoes. He says that the suggestion of Avelus created by his atifas arosh is offset by the fact that he's wearing mina olam, he's wearing shoes. Therefore, at least in private, he's allowed to wrap his head in an atifas yishma'elim. Now the Gemara goes back to the first statement, the Reisha of Shmuel, which wasn't so relevant to us then, but now we want to take it head on. Kol kera she'eno b'shas chimum eno kera. He's not mekayim the midst of kriya unless he does so at the time of chimum, when he's just heard about the death. For ha'amru, the Gemara asks, amru le l'Shmuel noch nafshi derav. I'm going to prove to you that Shmuel was Makayim Kriya for the loss of a great Talmud Chacham, and that's Rav, even though it was not B'shas Chimum. How do I prove that? Because Korale Tresar money. In order for Shmuel to demonstrate the depth and the profundity of the mourning over the loss of Rav, what he did was he actually ripped 12 garments, one on top of the other. And if that be the case, then it's going to take him quite a bit of time until he finally gets to the innermost garment, which is number 12, and he's ripping it for the sake of the mitzvah of Kriya, and it's not B'shas Chimum. Omar. This is what Shmuel declared after the death of Rav. Ozal Gavra. A person was taken away from this world. Davi Mistafina Minei, I was afraid of him. Why was I afraid of him? I was tongue-tied before him because of his extraordinary analytical ability, his wealth of knowledge and tradition, which he received from Rebbe and Reb Chia. And because of my fear of him, I was very careful in my deliberations, and I would not want to rule leniently. But now that he's gone, who am I going to be afraid of? So now he rips 12 garments that, let's say, he put on maybe one day, another day, or till he got to the inner garment, whatever it might be. And this is certainly not b'shas chimum. Another case, Amru Leila Rabbi Yochanan noch nafshei de Rabbi Chanina b'kara le tlesar itztole melsa. Now, in the case of Rabbi Yochanan, when he found out that Rabbi Chanina was gone, again he rips 13 robes that are made of silk. Omar, Azal Gavra Davi Mistafina Mine, taking away someone that I was afraid of. So we see that both Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan were fulfilling the mitzvah of Kriya and ripping their garments even after Shas Chimah. So Gemara says, Shani Rabbanon, the Rabbanon, if the Rabbanon pass away, that's always constantly, perpetually considered Shas Chimah. Why? The Kevan de Chol Shaita Midkere Shmatayu. We always consistently remember their teachings of Torah. And therefore we are always in a state of grief when we remember them. And therefore Kishas Chimum Dom. It's as if he did the Kriya B'Shas Chimum when he was in the state of intense grief. Amalei Ravin Bar Ada L'Rava. Amar Talmidach Rav Amram, this is what we heard from your Talmud Rava, Rav Amram, that Avel Kol Shiva Koro Lefanov, that during the Shiva period, he should allow for the Kriya itself to be in front of him, and And if he's going to put on another garment, he's going to have to do kriya on the second garment. Meaning it's not just halach of one maisa kriya, but you have to be lavush, you have to be wearing in a beged karua. So he's going to have to do a second kriya on the second garment. B'shas koro, b'Shabbos koro liachorov. On Shabbos he turns the kriya backwards, so nobody should see it. V'imbola achlif machlif v'yeno korea. And if he changes his garments, then he doesn't do a new kriya. So during the week, in Bala Hachlif Machlif Vikorea, but on Shabbos, he's Koro Me'achorov, but in Bala Hachlif Eno Korea. What has to be understood here is Eno Korea means because of Shabbos and it's the complexion of its sanctity and its fulfillment as a day of oneg, etc., etc. But really, there should be another fundamental issue here about kriya itself, which is one of the 39 malachas of Shabbos. So I don't know what the Havamina was that if he would be machlif his beged, he would be korea. I mean, we're talking about Shabbos here. Ki Tanya. So now we have a kasha because we see clearly that you don't require kriya dafka b'shas chimum hahi becovered aviv ve'imo. The kriya here is for a parent. And in the case of a parent, once again, it's like a perpetual state of avelus, of profound grief. And therefore, if it's an ongoing state of grief, then we can appreciate that it's always considered kriya b'shas chimum. Shmuel was talking about Shara Krovim, not Aviv Ve'imo that passed away. And they don't have that intense avelus of grief and mourning, and therefore your kriya has to be connected to avelus, and therefore it has to be b'shas chimum. The Gemara now asks the following question: are you allowed to sew up after the kriya? O son kroim misachim o ein misachim. We know that when you lose a parent and you do kriya, you're not allowed to sew up that kriya and repair it. And now we're asking, what about a second garment? Right? We said that in the case of parents, it's always considered shaschimum, and therefore, if he's machlif, gadim, he will have to do another kriya. And what's the law of the second kriya? Does it have a full-fledged status of a beged karua such that ein misachin? You're not allowed to sew it up and fix it up. Pligi ba'avua deravotia ubar kapara. Chan omer ein misachin. Chan omer misachin. Gemara wants to prove who holds what. This time, I'm going to prove the avua derav oshia the omer ein misachin. He's the one who holds that you're not allowed to repair and sew up the kriya. And how do I know this? The Omer of Oshia ein misachim. We don't sew it up. We don't sew it up. Miman shmiele. From whom did he have this tradition? Lav mi'avua. Probably he got it from his father. So that's called avua de Rav Oshia. And his father, of course, is therefore of Oshia. And the pasuk was that ein misach. The Gemara says, lo, that's not a proof, because mibar kapara rabbe shmiele. It could be that he had a tradition from his Rebbe bar kapara. So we have no proof as to which master held which opinion. Omar Rava Ovel Mitayel Be'unkali B'toch Beisa. Inside his house, he is in privacy. He's B'tzina. And on Shabbos, if he's B'tzina, then he can wear his ripped shirt. Gemara says, Abaye Ashkechel Rav Yosef, De Paris Le Sudra Areshe. Rav Yosef on Shabbos had a kerchief which he spread over his head, the Azil v'asi b'beisa, and he went out in his home. Amalei Abai said to him, Lo Sovel Amar, Ein Avelus b'Shabbos? How could it be that you are praving Avelus and being Paris Sidre, put on this kerchief over your head, and walking publicly? Everyone's going to know that you're an Avil, and we don't want to undermine Shabbos. Amalei Hachi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Dvarav Shebetinanoi. That in a private house he should be noig avelus, and therefore, Horasley Sudra Reshe, he was Makayim the din of Atifas Arosh, even though it's Shabbos, because this is what we call Dvarim Shebetzina. Rabbi Eliezer Omer Mishachar Beis Hamikdash Atzeres Kishabbos. This was our Mishnah back on Daf Yutes, in which Rabbi Eliezer equates Atzeres to Shabbos. Why? Because there's no 7-day holiday on Shavuos during what the Gemara calls Atzeres. And after the Churban Abayis, we cannot stretch a 1-day holiday and make it into a 7-day holiday. Now, if it's a 7-day holiday, then we understand that it interrupts Shiva. Because during the course of a 7-day holiday like Pesach or Sukkot, there's no opportunity to experience your Shiva, to mourn in a day that is Yontif and that has a mitzvah of Simcha. And Rabbi Eliezer says that Atzeres has an element of Simcha, for sure. But it doesn't have that element of a 7-day Yontif. So with regard to Pesach and Sukkot, which are 7-day yontivs, we understand that the entire 7 days is mufka from Avelus. It's days of Simcha, and therefore it's mafsik to Shiva, mavatal to Shiva. That we understand very well. But Shavuos is only 1 day. The answer is that we have another shita, and that's the shita of Rabban Gamliel. Amar of Gido Bar Menashe of Shmuel halacha ke Rabban Gamliel. We're going to pass like Rabban Gamliel, who says that even Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur are like Yomim Tovim, like the Regel, and they're Mevatel Shiva. And therefore, it's quite clear why Shavuos would be Mevatel Shiva. If Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah Mevatel Shiva, they don't even have the status of a regel with a full-fledged mitzvah of Simcha, then for sure, how much more so would it be clear that Shavuos is not Mevatel Shiva. And from the fact that Rabban Gamliel holds that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like Regolim and the Mevatel Shiva, how much more so Shavuos is Mevatel Shiva. That's the opinion of Rabban Gamliel, and that's a kula. Omar of Gido Bar Menashe Shmuel Rabban Gamliel, because in general we always paskin in Avelus. The Ikamanda Masli Lahader of Gido Bar Menashe Aha. We have another tradition according to which Rav Gido Bar Menashe said something totally different, not halacha Rabban Gamliel. But what did he teach? Kol shloshim yom tinok yotze b'cheik v'nikbar be'isha achas u'shnei anoshim avalo be'ish echad u'shtei noshim. So let's understand in general, when we're talking about kfura, which is out there in the old days, out in the private areas in the sticks somewhere, then one man is not allowed to be alone with two women. So during the burial, we've got to cover our bases as far as the Isa Yichud is concerned. And in the case of Isha Achas Uchnei Anoshim, that's mutter. So that could be a fine trio for this burial of a Tinok Yotzei B'chei. That would be one woman, two men, a trio. There's no chash of yichud. But as far as the burial is concerned, here we have a halacha called Tinok Yotzei B'shuk. And what that means is that normally we bury a person in a coffin, or at least we carry him out in a coffin, otherwise known in English as a bier, B-I-E-R. But in the case of Nebuch, a dead infant, we don't have to go that far and be mechabed the niftar with a coffin, but it's sufficient to carry the body out holding it in one's bosom. And that's called Tinok Yotzei B'chei.